Thank you. That concludes portfolio questions. The next item of business is a statement by Gillian Martin on proposed Grangemouth flood protection scheme. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and for this opportunity to update Parliament on Falkirk Council's Grangemouth flood protection scheme proposals. Last month, the Scottish Government informed Falkirk Council that ministers have decided that the next steps in the consent process for the Grangemouth flood protection scheme should be undertaken locally rather than nationally. This was based on consideration of the proposals put forward by Falkirk Council and the objections. Ministers deemed that it did not merit being called in to a public local inquiry. I believe it would be helpful, Presiding Officer, to provide some background on this decision and about where the next steps in the process for confirming flood protection schemes take place as part of this update. Last year, Falkirk Council gave public notice of the Grangemouth flood protection scheme. This started a statutory approval process under the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act 2009 and was followed by a period of 28 days during which interested parties could lodge objections to the scheme. During this period, Falkirk Council provided information to households and engaged with the local community through newsletters, social media, a website and in-person events. The deadline for objections closed on the 16th of June 2024 and Falkirk Council duly considered the objections received. Following that consideration, Falkirk Council made a formal decision to confirm the proposed Grangemouth flood protection scheme on a preliminary basis. Under the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act 2009, when a local authority receives objections to a proposed flood protection scheme from certain persons, it must refer the scheme to Scottish ministers to decide whether or not it should be called in for a public inquiry or whether it can continue to be considered by the local authority through a local hearing. 15 of the 22 valid objections received by Falkirk Council fell under a category that required that the Council notify ministers of the scheme. For instance, the objectors had an interest in the land where operations would be carried out, or in land which would be affected by the operations, or by any alteration to the flow of water caused by any of the operations. When a flood protection scheme is notified to ministers, the key consideration is whether the decision to confirm the scheme or not should be taken locally or nationally, with a decision being taken nationally sometimes described as being called in. In practice, this means that ministers must consider if the individual or collective issues raised in any objections are so significant that they should be considered nationally. This would be through a public local inquiry rather than through a local hearing held by the local authority. Ministers notified Falkirk Council on the 27th of March 2025 of their decision not to call in the Grangemouth flood protection scheme based on an assessment of the information provided by Falkirk Council, having had regard to matters set out in the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act 2009, such as the likely reduction in flood risk, the nature of objections and the likely effect on objectors. Falkirk Council will now progress with a local hearing, and this process usually takes around 12 to 18 months. In accordance with procedures set out in the 2009 Act, Falkirk Council have approached the Planning and Environmental Appeals Division to provide a reporter to lead this process. Once the reporter has held the hearing and provided their report, Falkirk Council can decide whether to confirm the scheme with modifications or with no modifications, or to reject the scheme. If the scheme is confirmed by Falkirk Council at that point, any person affected by the scheme can still appeal to the Sheriff Court. If the scheme is ultimately confirmed, Scottish ministers must direct, under planning legislation, that planning permission is deemed to be granted, subject to conditions, including the duration of the validity of the planning permission. As proposed in the notice sent by Falkirk Council to Scottish ministers, the proposed Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme would be the largest flood defence project in Scotland and one of the biggest in the United Kingdom. It is exceptional in terms of scale and financial cost and requires careful consideration to ensure it delivers for the local community. Initial costs for the scheme were £108 million in 2015. However, this has now risen to between £450 million and £672 million. That is why, in 2023, ministers and Falkirk Council agreed that the Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme would be removed from consideration as part of the existing national funding programme. Up until this point, Falkirk Council had received £23 million for the development of the scheme. Following their local hearing, should Falkirk Council confirm the scheme in its current form and wish to access further Scottish Government funding, it will be necessary to demonstrate that the scheme, in whole or in phased elements, is value for money assessed against other flood protection schemes across Scotland. The Scottish Government will now consider how and when the scheme is brought back into the standard processes for flood protection governance and funding. And in doing so, we must weigh up any investment decision, both in terms of the impact to the individual project, but also to the impact to any individual project has on its ability to invest in other areas. Separately from the process in relation to the proposed scheme, the Scottish Government has worked with Falkirk Council through a task force approach to examine options for improved and affordable flood resilience for Falkirk and Grangemouth residents and local communities. And I am meeting the leader of Falkirk Council, Councillor Meiklejohn, tomorrow to discuss these issues. More broadly, managing our exposure to floods and their impacts is a significant and growing challenge as climate change brings more severe and frequent flood events. Improving resilience to flooding is a priority for the Scottish Government, evidenced by publication of the first National Flood Resilience Strategy last December. Since 2016, the Scottish Government has allocated £570 million to local authorities for flood protection schemes and flood resilience, which has delivered improved flood resilience to over 6,000 properties across Scotland so far. The Scottish Government is working with COSLA and local authorities to reform the funding and governance for flood resilience, learning the lessons from delivering the first programme of schemes and ensuring that future programmes provide maximum benefit for local communities in the most efficient way. Presiding Officer, I am committed to improving Scotland's resilience to flooding, and that includes working with Falkirk Council on how we can improve flood resilience in the Grangemouth area. The Scottish Government has provided almost £23 million since 2016-2017 to support development work on flood defences in Grangemouth, and we will continue to work closely with the Council to improve flood protection for communities in that area. And I look forward to my discussion with the leader of Falkirk Council tomorrow on this matter, and I'm happy to answer questions on my statement.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes, after which we'll need to move on to the next item of business. Members wishing to ask a question that haven't already done so, please press your request to speak buttons. And I call first Stephen Kerr.
Can I welcome this ministerial statement and thank the Cabinet Secretary for the advance sight of her statement, because Grangemouth's future depends on urgent infrastructure investment to support regeneration and to protect one of Scotland's most strategically important areas. And the Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme is critical to this, because it will safeguard 6,000 residents, 2,760 homes, 1,200 businesses and nationally vital infrastructure. And as the Cabinet Secretary mentioned, under the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act 2009, the Scottish Government typically funds 80% of such schemes, and that leaves 20% with the local authority. But this model is not going to work in this instance because, as the Cabinet Secretary pointed out in her statement, current estimates are that the total cost of the scheme will be between £450 million and £672 million. And so Falkirk Council cannot possibly be expected to contribute at least over £100 million. And the Cabinet Secretary also mentioned the joint task force that was formed in 2024 to explore funding options, among other things, but ministers have yet to confirm the government's contribution or timeline. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, time is of the essence. It's 10 years since we started down this road. It's 10 years since the scheme was first identified as a #1 priority due to high risk and cost benefit. So what safeguards are in place to prevent delays from the local hearing process? And what's to stop Scottish ministers, after that process is concluded, from kicking the can further down the road and not making a timely decision? Because of the exceptional scale and cost
Mr.
and national
Kerr, I'm going to have
importance...
to ask you to conclude.
Yes. Because of the importance of the Grangemouth scheme, will the Cabinet Secretary confirm that we need a bespoke funding model for the scheme?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Stephen Kerr for that question, and I think it's important to reiterate that the next steps in the process for the Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme are to be undertaken by the local authority. And should Falkirk Council confirm the scheme in its current form and wish to access further government funding from the Scottish Government, it will be necessary to demonstrate that the scheme in whole or in phased elements is value for money and assessed against other flood protection schemes across Scotland. And the proposal from the Council, should we receive a proposal for the Council, we know already that it is exceptional in scale and indeed financial cost, and will require careful consideration to ensure that it is deliverable and it delivers for the local community. So the Scottish Government must weigh up any investment decision, both in terms of the impact to the individual project, but also the impact that the project has on the ability to invest in other areas. But ultimately, the decision on whether to proceed or not lies with the Council, and I am meeting Councillor Meiklejohn, as I mentioned, tomorrow morning to discuss some of these issues.
Sarah Boyack.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance notice of her statement? Given the concerns about the need to address the climate and nature crisis, will the Cabinet Secretary commit to discussing with Falkirk Council solutions to deliver effective environmental mitigation and compensatory measures to address the potential impact of the current design raised concerns by objectors? Can she clarify whether the objections submitted by Forth Ports have now been addressed, given the importance of access issues and the development of Grangemouth to Scotland's economy? And what additional communications will now take place to address residents' concerns? And finally, can the Cabinet Secretary justify why the Council will have to justify flood management measures when we know that sea level rise and extreme weather will increase the need for effective flood management, given there have already been 5 flood warnings in recent years in the area? And can she put on the record how many homes and businesses would be put at risk if costs and delays continue to spiral out of control?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as Ms Boyack knows, we've set out our flood resilience strategy. It was published in December with a lot of the detail on that, particularly on the risk that there is to Scottish communities if we do nothing. And of course, the Scottish Government has, over many years, indeed decades, has made available I will just take the 2020 programme for government. At the start of this parliamentary term, we committed an additional £150 million over the course of this Parliament for flood risk management actions. With regard to the particular objections in this case, it's not for Scottish ministers to be looking at. We have decided that it is important we hand back the consideration to the Council. However, some of the issues around both the funding and indeed what further assistance we might be able to give the Council, depending on their decision that they make, I will be discussing that with Councillor Meiklejohn tomorrow. Of course, the task force is absolutely critical in this. The task force is not something that has dissolved in any way. They will be taking forward a lot of the discussions around the complexities, but also the nature of some of the objections that they will have to look at how they might be able to resolve.
Thank you. And I call Michelle Thompson to be followed by Graham Simpson.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that statement, but fundamentally a clear line of sight for funding is still a huge issue. If there is no guarantee that the scheme in whole or indeed in part can be funded, it would seriously call into question the tens of millions of pounds already spent and being planned. So when will the aforementioned assessment criteria be set out for the scheme and others, and what further opportunities for widening the burden of funding have been identified through any discussions with the UK Government and or industry?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as I said, I've said in the statement, that it is for the local authority to decide if they take the scheme forward in part or in a phased approach or in a whole. And I think that will determine how they look at how they approach the funding issue here. And a lot of those discussions around that will have to happen with the local authority. As a locally elected member, Michelle Thompson, of course, has that regular dialogue with the local authority as well. The task force approach had been used to examine how to take forward improved and affordable flood resilience for Falkirk and Grangemouth residents and local communities. And it's very important that they are given the space and the support to do so. Michelle Thompson has mentioned about other funding opportunities that were there. I think we really need to see the plans that come back from the Falkirk Council on this issue before we can answer any of that. And as I said in my earlier answers to others, I will be discussing all of these elements with Councillor Meiklejohn, who of course will be leading those deliberations.
Simpson to be followed by Jackie Dunbar.
Given that this would be the largest flood protection scheme in Scotland and one of the biggest in the UK, irrespective of what the Cabinet Secretary has already said, does she not accept that this cannot go ahead? Should Falkirk Council want it to go ahead, it cannot go ahead without government help, either Scottish or UK government or both?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think it's important to mention that there are two governments here, and it's critical to the Grangemouth community. The criticality of this flood scheme is something that obviously the Council has taken absolutely very seriously, and the wider community as well. The multi-dimensional nature of the Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme project, the many groups that are involved, the many stakeholders that are involved, both at sort of like civic level and indeed in the industrial level, and the scale of the costs means that that's why we took the decision was made to have a task force approach was undertaken. Of course, it's not just the Scottish Government, as Mr Simpson mentioned, the UK Government as well. And of course, the UK Government has an important role to play in all aspects of the future of Grangemouth. You'll have seen the work that I've done with Ed Miliband and Michael Shanks at UK Government level on Project Willow in particular. So the future of the industrial cluster is something that we all have to take into consideration. The Scottish Government will engage with the UK Government, but we will do so at the point at which the Council comes back with the plans and how they wish to proceed.
Jackie Dunbar to be followed by Richard Leonard.
Officer, as Graham Simpson's just said, the proposed Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme is set to be the largest of its kind to date in Scotland. So can the Cabinet Secretary outline what steps have been taken to engage with the communities affected by this project?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, so Falkirk Council has been engaging with local communities on a regular basis throughout the years of the scheme development. The first consultation exhibition was actually held in 2018 and has been followed by multiple both online and face-to-face events, and they had public engagement events in February and March 2024 prior to the scheme notification in May 2024. Now, throughout the project, they have engaged on a regular basis with local communities. They've had dedicated social media associated with it and regular printed newsletters distributed to residential and commercial properties. Now that we have handed back and we have not called in this scheme, I'll be very interested to speak to Councillor Meiklejohn and others in the area about how they might continue and enhance their public engagement ahead of making a decision.
Richard Leonard to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Climate change is not abstract or theoretical for the people and workers of Grangemouth. It's very real and its challenges are very practical. What we have heard this afternoon is that the Grangemouth scheme still has no confirmed Scottish Government funding, still has no access to the usual flood risk management funding mechanism. When can the Government give a cast-iron assurance that there will be sustainable funding for the scheme, but that there will be an approach which sustains the Firth of Forth Special Protection Area, the Ramsar site, the SSSI, and sustains the people living in the communities affected?
Cabinet Secretary.
I understand that MSPs want cast-iron guarantees of an awful lot of things. But Mr Leonard has to appreciate that we need to leave the decision on how this is taken forward, when it's taken forward and what manner it's taken forward, to be able to understand that ahead of any discussions over funding.
Stuart McMullen, to be followed by Gillian Mackay.
Thank you, President Officer. Fortunately, Grangemouth has been spared some of the severe flooding conditions we've witnessed in other parts of Scotland in recent years. But can the Cabinet Secretary speak to the importance of proactive measures taken by the Scottish Government to tackle the threats of climate change, in addition to the preventative measures the Minister has set out today?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I thank Stuart McMillan for that question. And I mentioned a number of the strategies in my speech as well, but I didn't mention our response to the changes that we're seeing in climate. Is also we have our National Adaptation Plan, which we often refer to as SNAP 3, and that's got more than 200 commitments covering up to 2029. I think a number of members have mentioned the criticality of flood mitigation and prevention. Climate change is real. It is having an impact already on our communities. We've had a lot of named storms that have had an impact on our communities, and also we need to protect our public services as well as our communities as well in order to make them more resilient to climate impacts. So we're also introducing nature-based solutions to help address local issues, creating flood resilience and spaces for local food production and biodiversity, as well as providing that flood resilience as well. And we have got a range of advice and support through our Adaptation Scotland contract to enable individuals and public bodies. But I also say that the funding commitment is there in terms of year-on-year investment in flood resilience that is also delivered to local authorities as well as committed to by government.
So Mackay, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thanks, Deputy Presiding Officer. The building of the flood protection scheme, if it's approved in its current form, would take 10 years to deliver the entire project, 12 to 18 months to reach a planning decision, and there's been at least £23 million been spent on it, but no homes are any safer now than they were from potential flooding. What is the Scottish Government doing practically to speak to homeowners in Grangemouth about how flood prevention is being progressed in the meantime while they wait for this scheme to conclude?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Gillian Mackay, for that question. And I recognise our long-standing interest in this particular scheme proposed by the Council, which I have said before is exceptional in terms of scale. I mentioned the task force. The task force has not been sitting back and waiting for a decision from the Scottish Government. They have actually been actively looking into putting together a report that will look at how this project can be taken forward, how to take forward improved and affordable flood resilience for Falkirk and Grangemouth residents and local communities. It's expected that they are going to be submitting that report to ministers and indeed critically to Falkirk Council leaders shortly, and I look forward to engaging them in some of the solutions that they have found.
Willie Rennie, to be followed by Rona Mackay.
The Cabinet Secretary talks about nature-based schemes, but I can tell her, despite all our strategies and plans, nothing is happening on the ground as far as I can see. There is no engagement with landowners and farmers on an on-the-ground basis to make practical differences. There is an absence of knowledge and a shared understanding about how to tackle these problems. When on earth are these plans going to actually make a difference?
Cabinet Secretary.
Oh, well, I actually push back against some of the assertions that Willie Rennie, with the greatest respect, has made there. 19 of the cycle flood schemes have now been completed, and local authorities have had 8 years to make progress since a commitment to fund their schemes. There has been funding given to the local authorities, and indeed one of the regular catch-ups I have is on the progress that local authorities are making. Now, I would say to members that if you feel that the progress has not been been made by local authorities who have been given the funding to complete these flood resilience programmes. It's incumbent on all of us to take those local authorities, to scrutinise those local authorities. But also, I'm happy to engage with any local authority who members feel have not been stepping up to the plate in this regard. Absolutely.
Rona Mackay, to be followed by Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As today's statement laid out, it's vital to engage with those affected by a project of this scale throughout development and delivery. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide an update on the consultation of stakeholders relevant to this scheme?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, Falkirk Council obviously have done the engagement on this with a wide range of stakeholders, including residents, businesses, utility providers, other consultative bodies and indeed interest groups throughout the scheme development. The publication commenced on the 3rd of May with the posting of 10,000 statutory notices to affected parties, and it concluded on the 9th of May last year with the notice that was published in the Falkirk Herald. And obviously a copy of the notice, as you would expect, is published in the Edinburgh Gazette on the 10th of May. But dialogue remains open with all remaining objectors. I'm confident of that. It's one of the issues that I will be talking to Councillor Meiklejohn tomorrow at our meeting.
Megan Gallagher, to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
If Falkirk Council could not afford the 20% of the funding, the Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme cannot come into fruition. Falkirk Council cannot contribute over £100 million, and like many councils, they just don't have sufficient funds to commit to these types of schemes. So what options are available? Is the Cabinet Secretary suggesting that if councils cannot meet the 20% requirement, no protections will be put in place? Because if that is what the Government is saying, that means that communities will suffer as a result. So will the Cabinet Secretary, on the back of the question from my colleague Stephen Kerr, commit to looking at a bespoke plan for Grangemouth to safeguard these communities?
Cabinet Secretary.
In my meeting tomorrow with Councillor Meiklejohn, we are going through a lot of these issues. The important thing right now in terms of moving the scheme forward is that the Council make a decision on how they want to take it forward. And again, I understand that MSPs want cast-iron guarantees and commitments. This is for the Council to decide how and when they take forward this scheme. Then, of course, the Scottish Government will be engaging them in any kind of funding requirements that they have at that point at which they've made that decision.
And Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's vital to consider the numerous factors at play when implementing a flood protection scheme, not only for the local community's well-being, but of course for the environment too. Can the Cabinet Secretary therefore set out what assessment has been taken to ensure this scheme does not have an adverse impact on the environment? Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, there are many protections in legislature around this. Under the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act, local authorities are, of course, required to consider the environmental impact of flood protection schemes, and Falkirk Council carried out an environmental impact assessment, and this, you can actually see this on the flood protection scheme, the Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme website, and a habitats regulation appraisal was also prepared by Falkirk Council.
Thank you. That concludes this item of business. There will be a brief pause before we move to the next item of business to allow front benches to change.